Continuing our series of lectures on science fiction, this is Lecture 5, The Wasteland Remains. And I mean that in two ways. Primarily, that is the remnants of the wasteland, that which reminds us of the world we lived in before it was destroyed, implying that the remains or the remnants or that which is left over from our previous world may be an indication of the new world. Usually, these remains are more than just things, they're often people. The people who survive can carry on humanity. And I also mean the wasteland remains, as in the very idea of the wasteland continues. The enduring quality of post-apocalyptic narratives in our modern world, especially after the world wars. So let's get started talking about the wasteland as a frontier in science fiction, or as the new frontier of science fiction, because the new frontier always gives you the idea of the clean slate, starting over. And the wasteland does exactly that. They create the arena for a new kind of heroic action or a new kind of humanity. So what we have in the wasteland is an environment that reminds us that life is fragile and that civilization, everything we build, could easily be destroyed. So this very idea of the catastrophe story, this very idea of the destruction, begins in a very negative premise, but in fact can have a positive, can be a positive act of the imagination. Because the catastrophe story of the wasteland or the post-apocalyptic narrative, they can be an indication of a new beginning, right? That is sometimes the belief that life can only be fixed by starting over is as ancient as our very idea of stories altogether. The destruction is the ultimate destiny of creation. Look at the story of Noah's Ark, right? Genesis 1, God makes the world. Genesis 2, he makes humanity. Genesis 3, humanity falls from grace. And by Genesis 5, Noah's already building an ark. So from the very beginning, from the very literal beginning, we have the idea of the destruction of the world, in this case by flood, a natural occurrence. And what Noah preserves in his ark is not only people, but also animals. That is our way of life. Why does he do that? Because he wants to recreate the world again, just not with the people that are currently living in it. So the idea of the wasteland is very prevalent in storytelling, except that in science fiction, it is not a byproduct of a natural occurrence. It is not a byproduct of the supernatural power, but rather of humanity. One good example is The Scarlet Plague by Jack London. Now, the plot essentially gives you a strange and deadly disease, a plague, that arrives in San Francisco in the year 2013, which is uh, eerily close to our own year, considering the situation we're in. And there's one survivor, James Smith, who's a professor of literature, tells a story 60 years later to a group of youngsters, right? And in this population in 2073 is now less than 400 people. And despite his efforts to educate younger generations, a lot of them can't even read or do math. So the novel recounts Smith's adventure in those 60 years, the creation of the community, and then how that community is eventually threatened. So this story almost establishes a template, a narrative formula for many post-apocalyptic stories. And I'm sure you can recognize this outline from many of the movies that you've seen, or maybe novels that you've read that include some sort of apocalypse or destruction of the world, right? You first have the signs of the catastrophe, right? It's all around us. Then we realize that the world is ending, and there is a kind of like the Earth is on a clock, and it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen, and then ultimately it happens. And as it often happens, the wasteland stories, they prevent us from seeing the destruction, unless you're watching a movie, which is the very point of the wasteland story and the post-apocalyptic. I mean, a lot of the movies focus on the post. They focus on the apocalyptic, not on the post-apocalyptic. But science fiction focuses more on the post-apocalyptic story. What happens after the destruction? Um, so in this outline, you have the people who survive. They undertake a journey, and these survivors establish a community. So far, you can probably think about I Am Legend. You can probably think about the Book of Eli. You can probably think about these stories that are post-apocalyptic, wherein someone gets on a journey and they try to establish some sort of community, and they're fighting the reemergence of the wilderness, or it's not always a natural force, but also it could be a force that they cannot contend with. And there's always the antagonist, right? A community or a group like Waterworld, let's say, or even in the Book of Eli as well, a community that is struggling with these survivors. And the very idea is after the catastrophe story, after the wasteland narrative, what values are going to prevail in the new society? What is the new world going to look like? Is it going to look like the old one, better than the old one? So, destruction by disease is one of the most common in this style of science fiction, of the wasteland post-apocalyptic story. Destruction by disease in stories like The Earth Abides or Earth Abides by George R. Stewart. Now, when looking at this plot, it'll become apparent that is very much like the plot I just discussed a moment ago. So, a graduate student in ecology ish returns from a convalescent stay in a remote cabin. He was bitten by a snake, I believe, and he survives. And he's only able to return to civilization where he finds, most people have died after a fatal pandemic because he had a built-in immunity. So he meets this other character, another survivor, to start a family. And then as nature advances in the wake of destruction, he unsuccessfully tries to teach his children and other people things of the old world. And these are the remains that we were talking about earlier. And so decades later, you have a community that is thriving, but the new generation is almost reverting back to superstition, and they've forgotten the technological advancements of the past, right? So this is always very interesting that the wasteland is always in the future, but the people there often revert to a medieval style of belief and of engineering. And that's really interesting. Books like Anthem by Ayn Rand do something like that, where it's obviously in the future, so they tell us, because they mention cars and they mention things that we are used to now. But this futuristic world is so barbaric, so backwards, really, that it's always interesting to see that the wasteland is always in the future, but it's always a bleak future, a backwards future per se, not technologically advanced future. So essentially, by the end of the story, you have an antagonist who rises against the community, and then by the end, he comes to the realization that men come and go, but earth abides. That scripture from Ecclesiastes, and the idea is that in this struggle, earth will continue, but will we continue? And if we do continue, how will we be in this new earth, in this new world? So, destruction by war is another very popular motif of the post apocalyptic story, especially a shift that occurs after the wars. We can say that almost after every war, there's been a considerable amount of literature that has looked at the possibility of destruction by our own hands. Now, this is, this is understandable, right? Because it is human made actions that can precipitate the destruction of the world. But this very idea that we ourselves are our own worst enemy, that we will be the 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 makers of our own undoing. This is very interesting in post-apocalyptic fiction. Take for instance one of the iconic novels of the time that that touch on a theme like this. So, A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller Jr. You have a monastery in Utah that tries to preserve valuable documents from our own age after a nuclear explosion. So the book is essentially divided into three sections. The first section, which occurs 600 years after the nuclear holocaust, wherein they find these manuscripts, and they are trying to preserve this information that is technological by nature, but it has religious connotations, and it begins the thematic thread throughout the book, which is how humanity tries to preserve religion even into the 38th century, And the idea is they are trying to preserve religion because this is one of the tenets of humanity. Without it, where is our morality? Where is our being? So, for a book like this, even in section two, where it takes place in the 32nd century, and while scientific awakening is happening everywhere, there's always also the threat of war, which takes place in 38th century, where rival powers in the world essentially destroy everything through a major cataclysm. But all throughout, there is this monastic group that is trying to preserve religion, trying to preserve life and belief as they know it. So, other novels that you may recognize from your own readings is Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut and Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Both have that post-apocalyptic ending, like the one I just mentioned. Cat's Cradle pursues this co-inventor of the atomic bomb, who essentially developed another method of destroying the world called Ice 9, I believe, and it could freeze anything liquid, even blood, I believe, and essentially it is trying. They are trying to use it to destroy the world, and I think they are successful as that goes, in destroying the world by the end of the novel. And Bradbury's 451, Fahrenheit 451, ends with this uh, this ostracized community of readers who are standing outside of their city, who they themselves have become a book. They have become Hamlet, or they have become the Book of Psalms, whatever, and they're looking at bombs destroying the city from which they came. And then there's the idea, what happens then? And they go back to the city, and it ends like that. It goes back and ends um, in a very destructive way. But the implication is that there's a new way, there's a new world, right? Especially in that one, which is more dystopian, really. But after the destruction, there's always a return of nature, a return to destruction by nature. Nature is very prevalent in stories like these because it's about how how life still continues whether we're here to experience it or not. Stories like The Road, for instance, by Cormac McCarthy, they draw inspiration from the catastrophe story, but we don't really know what happens in the novel in terms of what causes the cataclysm that sends father and son out onto the road. But essentially, the clocks stop at 1:17. They tell us sheer of lights, and then the concussions, and then that's the end of that. And then the plot essentially revolves around the father and son who are trying to make it through a nightmare landscape after the mother commits suicide, and this is a cannibalistic world. But I think the very idea of movies like the books like these and movies like these is that it's allegoric of the brutality of the universe, but it also underscores the wasteland theme by pointing out that humanity continues in that almost metaphorical way of the road continuing. So as we near the end of our own uh, lecture and our own road, I'd like to reflect on the most important parts of the wasteland narrative that I think are crucial to understand. The wasteland of science fiction is not really a product of the supernatural. And we have to remember that because it isn't God or isn't the earth who has betrayed us. Although there may be stories where nature itself is destroying us, right? Like maybe 2012, I think. But even in these stories, there's always the implication that we did something to exacerbate the destruction, the natural destruction that's coming, right? Maybe pollution has exacerbated, so on and so forth. But the idea is that the destruction of the world happens not by a supernatural force, but by our own hand. Also, the destruction of the world is a way to remake the world. And that's very important because the fixation is not the destroying of the world. The key is to look at what comes after the world is destroyed. And will this world be better than the one that came before? And these post apocalyptic stories, they also focus more on what happens after the end of the world, how people put the pieces back together, than on the actual end itself. It doesn't have that need to show you the end of the world necessarily, though it may, of course. But these stories, they want to tell you what happens after the world ended, and can we build it again? So the big question is, Can we survive? And then the answer to that question is, what will we do if we do survive? Will our world be different than it used to be? Or are we going to find ourselves in the same situation again in 100 years or 200 years or whatever? So the Wasteland story allows us to know, or rather, to learn who we are when everything we were is gone, which is the very nature of this kind of narrative. It allows us to imagine a world where when everything that we thought made us is gone, then what makes us? So, this is the end of the lecture. Thank you for listening.